Good morning. We are beginning one of my favorite chapters of the Bible. We're telling one of my favorite stories in the Bible this morning. We're going to be in Matthew chapter 17. We're slowly but surely making our way through Matthew's Gospel. The beginning of this chapter, the first about 8 verses, but the first 13 in general, tell the story of the transfiguration of Jesus. This is a fairly well-known story. It's told in multiple gospel accounts. It's something that kind of is a focal point, especially in Matthew's gospel. And one of the things that is interesting about the transfiguration of Jesus is it has a lot of different elements to it. It's kind of like an onion. When you just keep peeling layers and layers and layers, there's a lot to this story, more than what would perhaps meet the naked eye. For example, there's obviously an extraordinary occurrence that happens here. Jesus' appearance is changed. He's transfigured. That in and of itself is pretty extraordinary. There's also the fact that Moses and Elijah are on this mountain with Jesus and with Peter and James and John. That's also pretty extraordinary. These are people that are dead, and now they're here on the mountain with Jesus, and so that's a pretty extraordinary thing. There's also this voice from heaven. This is something we've already seen in Matthew. We saw it back in chapter 4. It's the same voice. He says much of the same things, but there's a little difference, and we'll talk about that when we get to it. And then finally, this is where the layers come. There are numerous Old Testament allusions going on here in the transfiguration of Jesus. There is a lot, and I hope that I can get through it all in the allotted time that I have. One thing that's interesting looking at this story is that kind of, when you look at the first 8 verses, that tells the story of the transfiguration. Then verses 9 through 13, there's sort of an interaction that happens afterward between Jesus and the disciples. But the first 8 verses, the story of the transfiguration itself, while they're up on the mountain, it has a chiastic structure to it, where you have the symmetry that goes on here with a focal point in the middle. And so if we follow this idea, you have these two ideas, the bookends. You have a narrative introduction. Matthew is just simply telling the story. And then you have a narrative conclusion. Again, Matthew telling the story. Then you have some bookends with Jesus. You have the transfiguration of Jesus, where his appearance is changed. And then Jesus speaks in verse 7. Those two kind of mirror each other. Then you have some mirroring going on with the disciples. One is in particular Peter. Peter gives a response, and then the disciples give a response in verse 6. And with this structure, the focal point of this, the most central part of this, is the divine voice that we see in verse 5. People focus a lot on the transfiguration of Jesus, and they say, well, the story is about Jesus' appearance being changed and his glory is being shown. That's obviously very important, but it's not really the focal point of the story. It's more or less kind of a symptom of it. The focal point is what the voice from heaven says, and we'll look at that here this morning. Verse 1 says, "And after 6 days, Jesus took with him Peter and James and John his brother, and led them up a high mountain by themselves." So let's work backwards a little bit from this verse. We see initially that Jesus is leading them up a high mountain by themselves. Notice that it's not just a mountain, but it's a high mountain. That's kind of emphatic on the part of Matthew, because a mountain is obviously pretty high up already. But Matthew is sure to emphasize that this is not just any mountain, but it is a high mountain. And scholars are divided as to what specific mountain it is. I don't think that's necessarily all that important about where it is and so on. We know they're up on a real mountain. We just aren't sure which one. But we see that the high mountain is reminiscent of Mount Sinai. And this is something that Matthew does a lot in his gospel account, where you have these mountain stories, and they are reminiscent, if not full allusions and parallels to things that happen on mountains in the Old Testament. You could look at the Sermon on the Mount, for example. There's a lot of parallels. Jesus teaching on the mountain, Moses receiving the law on the mountain. There's a lot of parallels there. And in particular, there's parallels oftentimes with Mount Sinai. And we're going to see that to be the case here today. The reason why I say that there is some allusions to Mount Sinai here with the mention of a high mountain is because Jewish tradition, Josephus, for example, there are others that you could look to. Josephus called Sinai the highest mountain. I don't know if, in calling it the highest mountain, if Josephus is referring to the actual height of the mountain or referring perhaps to the significance of the mountain. We know Sinai is a pretty significant mountain. It's where Moses received the law of Moses. For the Jewish people, that was incredibly significant. But regardless, you see that Matthew is intentional in calling this a high mountain, and I think his Jewish readers would have recognized this. So he leads them up on a high mountain. They're by themselves. We see who's with Jesus. It is Peter, James, and James's brother John. These three seem to make up what is an inner circle in what is already sort of an inner circle with Jesus' disciples. You have the 12. Those 12 will later become the 12 apostles. And now you have within that already pretty intimate group, three that have a more intimate experience with Jesus. And we see these three a few times. Another notable example is when Jesus goes to the Garden of Gethsemane. He brings Peter and James and John with him. And so these three have a pretty intimate relationship with Jesus. And these three play pretty prominent roles when you read on the rest of the New Testament. Peter's the one, of course, we saw in the last chapter. He has the keys of the kingdom. Peter's going to give the first gospel sermon. Peter is going to make the first Gentile conversion when it comes with Cornelius. And so Peter is obviously quite important. There's also a couple of New Testament letters that bear his name. James, we know from reading the book of Acts, he's the first apostle to be killed. That's a pretty significant fact. And John supposedly outlived all of the other apostles according to secular history. And we have numerous books in our New Testament that bear his name, such as his gospel account or his 3 letters, and he's also the writer of the Revelation at the very end as well. And so these are 3 very prominent men that go up with Jesus on the mountain. Another thing that's interesting here, there may be another allusion to Sinai here. And the reason I say that is because when you go to Exodus chapter 24, this is where Moses goes up on the mountain and he spends 40 days up there and so on. There's these 70, I think it's 70 elders that go, but then there are 3 individuals that are mentioned by name that go along with Moses. And it is Aaron and his 2 sons, Nadab and Abihu. Now, Nadab and Abihu are well known for other reasons, for not so good reasons. But we see in Exodus 24 that Aaron and Nadab and Abihu go with Moses on Mount Sinai. They don't go as far as Moses goes. Moses will go up by himself. But we have these 3 particulars that are mentioned alongside with Moses. And so there's possibly some allusion going on there as well. And this is the reference to that. The Lord said to Moses, "Come up to the Lord, you and Aaron, Nadab and Abihu, and 70 of the elders of Israel, and worship from afar." Another thing that's really interesting here is Matthew mentions that this is after 6 days. So the end of chapter 16, this is the famous story like we looked at last week, where initially Peter has a really good moment. He says, "You're the Christ, the Son of the living God," in reference to Jesus. They have that great moment. But then Peter kind of ruins it by rebuking Jesus after Jesus began to show them what really it means to be the Christ and the Son of the living God. He's going to go to Jerusalem and suffer these great things at the hands of the Jewish leaders and be killed, but be raised on the 3rd day. And so Jesus tells them that. Peter rebukes him. And then Jesus kind of points it in their direction now, saying, if you want to follow me, you need to take up your cross. And so this is after that, and now Matthew mentions that 6 days have passed. The reason that this is kind of interesting is because Matthew doesn't often do this. Matthew is regarded, when you compare the other gospel accounts with each other, which isn't necessarily a good thing to do. They're each their own individual writing. They're not necessarily meant to be harmonized with each other. But when you compare them and when you look at the tendencies of one versus another, Matthew is kind of regarded as the least chronological of them all, where Matthew's order of events, it's not necessarily chronological, it's more topical, there's something that Matthew is doing that where chronology doesn't necessarily matter that much to Matthew. And he doesn't mention chronology very often, which is why when he does, it's worth noticing. Perhaps this is another Sinai allusion. Again, we look at Exodus 24. We're going to be in this chapter a lot. Also Exodus 34 later on. Moses went up on the mountain, and the cloud, which is the presence of God, that's what that's reminiscent of, the cloud covered the mountain. The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. Maybe there's something there. I'm not entirely sure. It's something that perhaps Matthew's readers would have been aware of. One last detail about verse 17, or about verse 1 in chapter 17. We see that Jesus is the initiator of all of this. Sometimes the disciples get a little headstrong, like we've seen Peter already do, and like we're going to see him do in this section, really, and as he's going to do later on. But Jesus is the initiator of this. It's Jesus who takes them. It's Jesus who is leading them on this mountain. It's Jesus who purposely chose these three. Jesus is the one who's initiating all of this action. And so what we see is this is intentional on the part of Jesus. And it makes you wonder why. Why is it that Jesus is leading these men up this mountain? What is it that Jesus is going to show them? Well, we're going to see in a moment what Jesus is going to show them, and it's going to be quite significant. So with that, we come to verse 2. And he being Jesus, was transfigured before them, and his face shone like the sun, and his clothes became white as light. This is kind of the basis of the entire namesake of the story. It's called the Transfiguration of Jesus. That's how we refer to it. There's a heading in my Bible that specifically says the Transfiguration. And so this is what really the story, this is what it's all about for the most part. And it's interesting, we think of the word transfiguration and we think of this specific story, but that word really has a general meaning behind it. The Greek word that's used is metamorpho, and what it means is simply to have a change in appearance. You sometimes hear the word metamorphosis, and that's kind of where we get that word from, is this particular Greek word. There's a well-known short story, I forget who writes it, but it's called The Metamorphosis, and it's a story about a guy who wakes up one morning, and he's a giant bug. And he's changed into a bug, and he's laying on his back, and he can't do anything, and he's hollering for people, and they're not helping him. It's kind of a creepy story. But that's called the metamorphosis because his appearance changed. He went from a person to a giant bug. And so this is the idea here. It's simply a change in appearance. It can also be translated, this word, as transformed, such as in 2 Corinthians chapter 3 or in Romans 12 and verse 2. That verse in Romans 12, you might recall, is where Paul says, don't be conformed to the world, but be transformed by the renewal of your minds. That verse, it can also mean to be transformed. And so, this is what's happening here. Jesus' appearance has been changed. One other detail about this, and you may not see this unless you look closely at the Greek. You can kind of see it in the English, but it's not as clear. The verb transfigured, that's a verb, because it's an action. It's passive in the original language. And what that means is it's not being done by Jesus, but it's being done to Jesus. It's like the difference between being run over and running over something else. Either the action is done to you or you're the one doing the action. And in this case, it's done to Jesus. You could assume who it is that's doing that to Jesus. It would evidently be the Father. And so he's transfigured there. And what this specifically means, there's two aspects of this that Matthew points out. And he differs from Mark in this way. We see that his face is shining like the sun, and we see that his clothes have become white as light. And so this is how Jesus' appearance has changed. His face has changed, and his clothes have changed. What we see happening, I don't know if I have this in my notes or not. I'll mention it in a moment. I don't want to get ahead of myself. What we see happening here, face is shining, clothes are white. The majesty and the glory of Jesus is being revealed to these three disciples, to Peter, James, and John. And Peter actually references this in 2 Peter chapter 1. He speaks more about the voice that they hear from heaven, which we'll talk about in a moment. But notice this from 2 Peter 1 that Peter says. And Peter, interestingly enough, the transfiguration, that story is used in a lot of different ways for different purposes. Peter uses it in an apologetic sense here. Because what he's saying is, hey, this thing that we're teaching you, this thing that we're talking about, we didn't make this up. We did not follow cleverly devised myths when we made known to you the power and the coming of our Lord Jesus Christ, but we were eyewitnesses of his majesty. The majesty is seen right here in Matthew 17 when they're seeing the transfigured Christ on that mountain. They also will see his majesty when he's raised from the dead. Verse 17, for when he received honor and glory from God the Father, and the voice was borne to him by the majestic glory. That voice is what we're going to read of here in a moment. When he said, this is my beloved Son with whom I am well pleased, we ourselves heard this very voice borne from heaven, for we were with him on the holy mountain. And so what Peter's getting at here, he's saying, hey, the stuff we're teaching you, this isn't made up. We've seen it, we've heard it, we were there on the mountain. His majesty and his glory was there, we beheld it, and we heard the voice from heaven say as much. And so Peter uses that as an apologetic to prove that what he's saying is in fact truthful. Another thing that's interesting when you look at this, when you look at Mark's account of the transfiguration, he makes no mention of Jesus' face. Mark mentions that his clothes became white as light. No mention of his face. Well, so why does Matthew mention that? Well, here's another parallel, another allusion to Mount Sinai. Because Moses, when he came down from the mountain in Exodus 34, his face was shining, to the point that the people of Israel were scared to approach him and they had to put a veil on his face. So we see this in Exodus 34, verses 29 and 30. When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the testimony in his hand, as he came down from the mountain, Moses did not know that the skin of his face shone because he'd been talking with God. And so here we see the direct causation of Moses' face shining. It's because he's been talking with God. God's glory is being shown in Moses. And then in verse 30, Aaron and all the people of Israel saw Moses, and behold, the skin of his face shone, and they were afraid to come near him. And later in the chapter we read that they have to put a veil on his face because it's just simply too much. And so here's another parallel to Mount Sinai, and in particular a parallel between Jesus and Moses. There's a lot of that going on here as well. So you see the layers to this. It's not just comparing the Mount of Transfiguration to Mount Sinai, it's comparing Jesus to Moses. And as we'll see, Jesus is in fact greater than Moses. Verse 3 says, and behold, there appeared to them Moses and Elijah talking with him again being Jesus. There's a lot that is made about this, about the significance behind Moses and Elijah being on the mountain there. There's a few theories that I think hold weight, and Matthew doesn't elaborate a whole lot on it, so we really are left guessing. And it's not really good to speculate, so keep this kind of open-ended, if you will. Most people assume that the significance is the fact that you have Moses who represents the law and you have Elijah who represents the prophets. And this goes back to what Jesus said in Matthew 5 and verse 17 when he says, I haven't come to abolish the law and the prophets. I haven't come to abolish them but to fulfill them. People who hold to this say this is the moment where Jesus fulfills the law and the prophets. I don't know if that's the be-all, end-all of it, but you can see why people would say Moses represents the law, because he's the one that delivered the law from God, and Elijah representing the prophets. There are some holes in this theory, though. One, Elijah was not a writing prophet. And so that's kind of significant. If Elijah's going to represent a whole section of Scripture, he wasn't a writing prophet. And so that's one thing. And another thing is Moses was a prophet too. So why is it that Moses has to represent the law and Elijah has to represent the prophets? That sort of thing. So there's holes to that too. It's not a be-all, end-all type thing. Another significance to this, and I think this holds a lot of weight, and it's a parallel that fits with what we're seeing take shape here. Moses and Elijah both had some pretty well-known encounters with the Lord on mountains. So that's another part of this that could also be significant, and I think is significant. Still another part that could be at work in this as well is on the part of Moses and Elijah. There were expectations of a Moses and Elijah type figure to come. There's the expectation that you read in Deuteronomy 18 of a prophet like Moses who's going to come. We know that that's Jesus, and we'll see as much later on. We're going to come back to Deuteronomy 18 toward the end if we have time. And in Malachi 4, there's the reference of the Elijah who is to come. We've already seen, I think it's in Matthew 11, I have that reference later on, that John the Baptist is the Elijah who was to come, who did come and who they killed, right? But there were these expectations. There was a Moses-like prophet that was going to come, and there's this Elijah figure, the forerunner, who was also going to come. And so that is perhaps another significant aspect of this, the fact that both of these men had an expectation of a figure like them coming again. And you can see it in John 1 and verse 21. This is where they're kind of grilling John the Baptist when they say, well, are you the prophet? John says, no. They say, are you Elijah? He actually denies it, but he is Elijah. He may not have known it. Possible significance, could it be all of the above? Each of these have a lot of weight to them. I think there could be a little bit of all of it going on. It doesn't have to be a mutually exclusive kind of thing. Each of these have significance. Verse 4, Peter said to Jesus, Lord, it is good that we are here. If you wish, I'll make 3 tents here, one for you and one for Moses and one for Elijah. If you read into this, and I'm not saying you should, but if you read into this, Peter almost kind of sounds pompous here, doesn't he? Lord, it's good that we're here. I don't know if he's saying it's good that they're here specifically, if he's just maybe happy to be there, maybe he's eager to serve Jesus. Peter sees that he's in the right place at the right time. It's good that we are here. And then he says, if you wish, I'll make some tents. One for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah. Notice initially the shift from we to I. He says, it's good that we're here. Now I'm going to take the lead. I'll make you these tents. A lot's made about the significance of these tents, if there's any significance. I'm not sure that there is. There's perhaps some significance to the Feast of Tabernacles. A lot of people read into that. It's unclear. Maybe he just wanted them to have a tent so that they had a place to lay their head. Maybe he's wanting to prolong things. Maybe he wanted this to be a multiple day kind of thing. I don't know. One other thing, and this is kind of the significant part of this. This is the part where I think Peter is wrong. He seems to be holding Moses and Elijah in equal standing with Jesus. And you see this in the fact that each of them gets a tent. Each of them gets the same treatment. Jesus, you get a tent. Moses, you get a tent. Elijah, you get a tent. It's kind of like Oprah. Everybody gets a tent. Well, what we see is that Jesus is not their equal. And don't be mistaken, Moses and Elijah, they're held in very high regard, but they're not Jesus. And the voice from heaven is going to make that clear. He was still speaking, Peter was, when behold, a bright cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, "This is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. Listen to him." We have another parallel to Sinai, a cloud on a mountain. The cloud on Sinai was God's presence there, God's glory there. And we have this parallel here. This goes back again to Exodus 24. He went up on the mountain, Moses did, and the cloud covered the mountain, and the glory of the Lord dwelt on Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. So once again, we have another parallel to Mount Sinai. You have a cloud here on this mountain. Another thing that's really interesting, I'd never actually noticed this before, but one of my commentaries pointed this out. Have you ever thought about a bright cloud overshadowing something? That's a bit of a paradox. Bright clouds usually don't overshadow things. If it's bright, it's usually bringing light. It illuminates things. But you have a bright cloud here, and it is overshadowing. And what we see happening here is God, on the one hand, He's self-revealing. There's this glorious cloud there on the mountain. But on the other hand, He's also self-veiling. Just like Moses and just like the people of Israel couldn't handle the fullness of His glory, He probably realizes that Peter and the others aren't going to be able to handle it as well. And so that bright cloud overshadows them. It could have blinded them with the full brightness of the Lord, but He doesn't let that happen. Instead, it overshadows them. That's a bit of a paradox. And then the voice from heaven makes this proclamation. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." Yogi Berra used to have the expression, it's deja vu all over again. And this is a deja vu once again, because we've heard this voice before at the baptism of Jesus in chapter 4. In that moment, Jesus was the recipient of those words. Now it's the disciples. They're the ones now that are being spoken to. They're the ones that hear this message. "This is my beloved Son, with whom I'm well pleased." And what we see happening here in this example, and you can see it with Moses and Elijah there on the mountain, you could see it with the parallels. Jesus, and in particular Moses, but you could make the case for Elijah also, they're kind of put in this juxtaposition where you put them side by side and you compare them. Peter has the tendency here to equate them, to make it seem like they're equals. Jesus, you get a tent. Moses, you get a tent. Elijah, you get a tent. But here we see in this juxtaposition that Jesus is greater than them. And one notable example of this, the Hebrew writer makes this case. Jesus is a son. Moses, you could say a lot of good things about Moses. One thing you can't say is that he was the Son of God. The Hebrew writer says this in Hebrews 3. Moses was faithful in all God's house as a servant, and that's worth being commended. He's faithful. Moses was a faithful servant. He testified to the things that were to be spoken later. Moses deserves to be commended for that. But, you see the contrast. But Christ is faithful over God's house as a son. So within a house, who's more important, the servant or the son? It's obviously the son. And then the Hebrew writer makes an application there at the end of that verse. And we see a differentiation here between what the voice said in chapter 4 and what the voice says here in chapter 17. God adds this command. Listen to him. And by listening, it doesn't mean just audibly hear him. That word in the Greek, it's akuo, I believe. And the implication of that is not just hearing, but doing, like what James says. Don't just be hearers of the word, but be doers of it. That's the implication here in what the voice from the cloud says. Listen to him. We see in Hebrews chapter 1, God previously had spoken by the prophets, like Moses, like Elijah, but now he speaks by his son. And so now it's Jesus that they were to listen to.
There's a after listen to him, exclamation point. Did yours have that?
I copied and pasted it, so
Oh.
let me see. Yeah, it's just a period in mine. Yeah.
This and I'm going like, listen to him, and I just see the period, punctuation helps to kind of get the feel of what's going on here.
Yeah.
And so, but when you follow with an exclamation point, listen to him, if you say it in that sort of a tone, or if listen to him with a little more excitement, with a little bit more power, it explains why they fell on their face. It helps to understand the fear that overtook them. It'd be like somebody,
Yeah.
being very forceful in their in their demand. So that I didn't know if yours just had that.
Yeah, that's how the ESV has it. And it's hard because in the Greek there's no punctuation at all. In the original Greek, it's actually incredibly difficult to read because the original writings were unsealed, and what that means is the letters were all capital, there's no spaces, no punctuation, nothing. It's incredibly hard to read and hard to differentiate. And so sometimes you got to read into that when you're getting into punctuation. I think an exclamation mark would certainly be appropriate here. Steve?
If it was an imperative, if the listen, or the verb was an imperative, then,
Which I think it is.
yeah, then the exclamation point would be the reason they put it in there.
Yeah. Maybe I'll write a complaint to the ESV people. Silly committee of people. One thing that's happening here, the voice, we can assume it's the Father, gives this command, and I do think it is in the imperative in the Greek. Listen to him, hear him. We have another parallel here to Moses. When you look at Deuteronomy 18, this is where the Lord says that there is a prophet like Moses who is going to come. Notice what he says at the end. Deuteronomy 18 and verse 15, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me. This is Moses speaking. A prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen. This is a well-known passage to Matthew's readers. And so when they read this story of the voice from the cloud saying, listen to him, this immediately draws them to Deuteronomy 18. This immediately draws them to think, oh, this is the prophet like Moses who was coming. This is the one now that we need to listen to. Except he's not just a prophet like Moses, he's a prophet greater than Moses. Verse 6, when the disciples heard this, as Amos said, they fell on their faces and were terrified. But Jesus came and touched them, saying, rise and have no fear. And when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. I think this is an appropriate reaction, don't you? They're already seeing Jesus transfigured. That's enough in and of itself. But now the cloud is there, and they hear a voice from the cloud, and it gives a forceful command. Listen to him. They fall on their faces, and they are terrified. We have another comparison to Mount Sinai, another comparison to Moses. In Exodus 34, the people there, they were afraid of Moses after seeing his face. We read that in Exodus 34 and verse 30. And notice again the contrast that's going on here. Jesus' face is shining. The disciples' faces are hidden. Their faces are down. They can't even think about putting their faces up to behold what is in front of them. And so there's quite a contrast here. Jesus, his face is shining. The disciples' faces are hidden.
It's startling the difference between they're just not just amazed, not just looking at them, staring at them. They're completely humble. They hide their faces.
Yeah. Yeah, they're not just kind of in awe. They're terrified. They're scared. Brad mentioned that they are really humbled in this. And it reminds me a little bit of Isaiah when he sees that heavenly vision in Isaiah 6, and he says, woe is me, right? Kind of like we see happening here with the disciples. So they're terrified. Their faces are on the ground. But Jesus comes and gives them some comfort. He says, rise and have no fear. And what we see, they are afraid to approach Jesus, so Jesus approaches them instead. This says something very good about Jesus. They lift up their eyes. They see no one but Jesus only. You have something, Seth?
How would they know it was Moses and Elijah?
That's the question everyone asks, right? How could they recognize them? I don't know if they could maybe, because there's no dialogue that's mentioned here. We don't know what they were saying. Maybe Jesus referred to them by name. I don't know, because it's not like there were pictures of them or anything. That is a good question. A lot of people wonder that. I don't know. Yeah, they might have had name tags or something. Verse 8, when they lifted up their eyes, they saw no one but Jesus only. So now they're alone. It's just the three of them, and it's Jesus. Moses and Elijah are gone. And I think this is a perfect fitting for the end of this. Because think about what is being portrayed to them. It's no longer that Jesus is in equal standing with Moses and Elijah and the like. Jesus stands alone. Jesus is the beloved Son. It's Jesus that they are to listen to. And so when they lift their eyes, it's Jesus and Jesus alone. I think it's a perfect illustration for the state of affairs here. I'm not sure I have enough time to get through verse 13, so I think I'll quit there. Any comments, Amos?
To answer Seth's question, not assuredly, but they were talking. Jesus was talking, and in their conversations, it might have been known that one was Moses and one was Elijah by the rhetoric that they may have been sharing with one another. The other thing is when you talked about our witnesses, our three witnesses, you notice that's Jesus is speaking with the authority of the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and they were always going, well, this is Moses, 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 and so now you have these witnesses, three disciples, which happens also to be the number that you would use when you have a dispute. You know, it's pretty common that you would bring 2 or 3 witnesses with you. And that's how that is also a pattern in this situation. But you can see how people, if it was just Jesus, then they say, oh yeah, right, you didn't, you heard God's voice, you heard, this and that. And I can see, now you have 3 people disputing or siding with Jesus that his word is greater than that of Moses and the prophets. And so that's where I see this being very important. Same thing with being on the Mount Sinai.
Yeah.
Moses had those, 3 with him? Aaron
and his sons,
yeah.
So Amos touched on a couple things. One is, going back to what Seth asked, how did they know it was Moses and Elijah? Well, they were talking. Matthew says as much. Wouldn't you like to be a fly on the wall for that? In the age where it seems like your phone is constantly listening to you and everything you say is being used against you and so on, wouldn't you love it if one of them had an iPhone and Apple could track what they were saying or something? That would be really interesting to hear what was said. And perhaps that's how they knew. Something in the conversation might have given them away. And another thing that Amos touched on is the idea that under the Hebrew law, when disputes came up, you needed 2 or 3 witnesses for something to be credible. Well, here Jesus has 2 or 3 witnesses with him. He's got 3, Peter and James and John. This makes this very credible. And I don't think this would have happened if the witnesses weren't there, because otherwise what would really be the point? It's for the benefit of Peter and James and John to see that. Jesus knows the glory that he has. So I think it's for Peter and James and John to see that. And to not just see his glory, but to get the clarification. This is the one you need to listen to now. Moses and Elijah, they're great, but they're not Jesus. They're not sons. It's now through Jesus that God speaks and has spoken. You had something, Steve?
Connection back to Sinai is Elijah himself was sent to Sinai. God said, eat now because you got 40 days and 40 nights to get to Sinai and the journey's going to be too great for you. So Moses started at Sinai. 40 years he was in the promised land. Elijah started the promised land. 40 days and 40 nights he was at Sinai. And in both of them, the Lord passed by. The Lord passed by him. So I think maybe one of the connections with Elijah is he went to Sinai too.
Yeah. A lot of connections with Moses and Elijah, with mountains, with Mount Sinai in particular. They both went to Sinai. Now Jesus is there, and we see kind of the fulfillment of that.
Brad bringing up in his class a couple times, or sermons a couple times, is we always see this picture of somebody making it to heaven and Jesus is standing there in a robe giving them a hug. But when John saw Jesus raised from the dead, he fell on his face like he was dead. So when they fell on their face, John's going to do it again when he sees him in the book of Revelation.
That's kind of an interesting point. Steve brings up when John sees Jesus in Revelation, he falls to his face. And when you look at how John describes him, I think that's an appropriate reaction, right? And it's interesting John does that there because he's seen this before. John is not a stranger to beholding the glory of Christ and falling down. That shows you that glory is really something to behold. All right, we'll call it there. We'll pick back up in verse 9 next week, Lord willing. Thanks for being here.